And our next step is to expand our exhibition space right here in this facility. For the first time in the history of this museum, all exhibitions will now be the only thing that this building will be an exhibition space as opposed to offices and the like. So we're making progress and we're very happy about that. We have a very busy spring. Keep your eyes open. This is just one event, but there are many more to come, including some representatives from the Smithsonian coming, more about our early man exhibit, and that will be very, very important. I am going to introduce Chuck Loomis. He is a friend of the speaker, and he knows him better certainly than I do. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome with me Chuck Loomis.
Well, we're here celebrating Texas independence, and I think we really need to thank George and the museum staff and the docents and everyone involved, Rodney and Sandra Joy, Ruth Crawford from Meridian, if she's here. These folks give a lot of their time and a lot of their money and effort to preserve Bosque County history and Texas history, and we're really, really proud of that. And they deserve our thanks. I saw two articles in the newspaper this morning that made me think about this museum. One was the ISIS bulldozing the city of Nimrod today. 1300 BC, they went in there with bulldozers and leveled things that were 4,000 years old. And then the disturbing pictures on the news a couple of nights before that, where they're in the museum in, what is it, Mosul? Yeah, Mosul. With sledgehammers, knocking down priceless antiques. Yeah. And it makes you think, we better be thankful we're in a country like this, where we don't have to worry about that. You know, it's just amazing. The other article I saw, I don't know, you probably all saw it, but in Oregon yesterday, they found a scraper made out of agate or flint, just like the ones that George has on display out here. But it was found 8 inches below the dust deposit from Mount St. Helens, which occurred 15,800 years ago. So man has been here 16,000 years as opposed to the popular thinking of 12,000 years a few years ago. It's going to bring more focus on your horn shelter, which is one of the top 3 paleo sites in the United States. It's going to put more focus on that, I think, than we all realize. George said that they're doing a DNA on some of that now. And that DNA may come back a lot older than we thought it might be. But I think it's going to bring even more attention to the great museum that you have here. And this is one of the greatest museums in Texas as far as I'm concerned. We're honored today to have Jeff Hengesbaugh from Glorieta, New Mexico. His partner, Bob, where's Bob? Is also here with him, his partner in crime, or business, I should say. Jeff and his wife, Amy, reside in New Mexico and Arizona for most of his life. For 30 years plus, he's focused on Spanish borderlands, Texas, New Mexico, anywhere there was a Spanish influence. And of course, Bosque County, the Brazos River, were all named by the Spanish. He's lectured on it, he's written on it, he's an expert on it. I think you'll find that he's a unique, passionate person about this subject. And I don't know if there's anybody else in the United States that knows any more about it than Jeff does. I met him 3 years ago at an antique gun show in Waco, and in 5 minutes' time, he had me convinced that he knew a lot of history. And his passion just comes across in his presentation and how he goes about doing it. So I kept his card, and maybe a year later I was going to be in Santa Fe. I thought, I'm going to call this guy, because I really liked him. So that was about 3 or 4 years ago. So I called him up, and he's a gun collector, and so am I. So I called him up, and I said, Jeff, do you remember me? I talked to you down in Waco. Oh, yeah, I remember you. Come on out to the house. And I said, well, how do I get there? And this tells you a little bit about the uniqueness of this guy. He said, well, you leave Santa Fe, you get on the interstate, and when you come to Glorieta, you turn right. And the road forks, the gravel road forks. And he said, take the one to the right. And I said, well, how will I know when I get to your house if it's that small? He said, there's 5 or 7 wooden ox carts parked in my front yard. and I didn't have any trouble finding this house. And these are ox carts with solid wood wheels, probably this high, Joe.
Oh, yeah, at least.
I mean, monstrous thing. He's like a used car dealer in Glorieta, New Mexico.
Use ox cart.
He also has access to a private museum there that's owned by a guy named Gordon. And Jeff acquires a lot of things for this museum, but it is a fascinating museum. If you aren't familiar with Glorieta Pass, that's when our Confederate forces were defeated by the U.S. Army and mainly the Colorado militia, probably.
Colorado volunteers.
Volunteers. They drove the Confederates out in New Mexico in the Civil War, and he does a lot of metal detecting, and he's an expert on the Glorieta Pass Confederate Civil War battle. When he took me in his house, the other thing that I found unique was he had a full Eastern Indian birch bark canoe. And canoes are a lot bigger than you think they are. It's a pretty big canoe. And yesterday I was with he and Bob, and I saw him purchase a Mexican cannon that we ended up putting in my pickup. Nearly put us all in the hospital. He's a very unique person. The only other story I can relate to his uniqueness is when he got back from Vietnam, I think. He took 6 months out of his life with a group, and they got on horseback. They left Arizona and went all the way to British Columbia in 6 months on horseback, using 1840s equipment and technique. Every fire, you couldn't carry a match. Every fire had to be done by flint and steel. He's the closest thing to a 21st century mountain man that you'll ever meet. So I'd like to introduce Jeff.
Thank you, Tommy. Man, pretty good. I'll give you a little bit of history. I graduated from San Diego State in zoology, and that time they drafted you out of college and went to war and then come back and finished it up. I wrote a screenplay, regretfully, and it almost sold about Vietnam. I thought, well, this is pretty easy. And so I went, it was turned down because it was premature. So I got a job as a fireman. Long story short, I didn't know how to write a novel, so I said to heck with it and jumped on a horse and rode to Canada. That started a sequence of events where I'd end up writing. Well, I went from Arizona to Canada, Arizona to Wyoming, crisscrossed the West on horseback using all the tools. Don't ask me why. My dad sold cars, and I was a Boy Scout for 2.5 days. Someone stole my candy bars and crushed my tent. And I thought Sierra clubs had tennis courts. I mean, I wasn't a wilderness guy. I was a good shot, but I didn't want to hurt nothing. But anyhow, I ended up spending dang near a third of my life in saddle. I showed up at Glorieta Pass in the 1980s with no screenplays sold and no occupation and a very sore bottom. So I had been going into the dust bins of Mexico for 30 years looking for plunder. Plunder is a common term for a mountain man, toys for boys usually, but anything. And I trained myself over a period of time and realized pretty quick that there was roughly 450 years of very, very exciting history before John Wayne pulls a pistol. And I never returned. I live in Glorieta. Right up the road about 8 miles is where Coronado in 1540 staged his military for search for gold out on the Great Plains. That's just 8 miles from my house. I live in a gunsight pass where the trail back and forth between Pecos and Santa Fe, the Pecos Indians were the main Indian auxiliaries helping the Spanish as they held their position as the northernmost outpost of the Spanish Empire. And I found myself getting more and more enamored with this whole concept, and at the same time realizing that there's a tremendous hole in American consciousness about the Spanish West. I call it a West inseparable, same geography. two different times in the rivers that merge. And Hollywood has given us Zorro and the Cisco Kid. That's about it. The difficulty with this is partly to blame, the Spanish are partly to blame. In 1821, after 350 plus years, Spain was kicked out. And within roughly 2 decades, through war and treaty, the United States took a third of northern Mexico and absorbed it, and would eventually become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So things got side-railed pretty quick. And then, of course, the minute we took over that territory, it became Jamestown, the Alamo, Custer's Last Stand, and Tom Mix. It got sealed pretty much over. So I found myself in the business of selling Spanish and Mexican artifacts. I could go into deep Mexico and bring out a fire striker. They called it an eslabon, which means a chain link, or a chispa, which means a sparker. It would be 200 years old. I could pay $3 for it. It'd be worth $100. I could sell it to you for $10, but it took me $150 of explaining before you'd buy it. So it became somewhat of a hobby for years as I continued to hold my position there in Glorieta Pass. But that's the quick version of Hengesbaugh. At this particular moment, I'm involved in a screenplay. I haven't given it up. It takes place pretty much in your backyard. It's about a young lady from Spain who bilocates. In other words, you're here and you're also at home talking to your kids. And she bilocated amongst the Humano buffalo hunters, the year 1620. And she appears not like any other appearances. She appears somewhere between 500 and 1,000 times among these Indians. We call them the Humanos. 1620, you have the Vaquero Apaches moving east to attack the Texans. You have the Caddos starting to be backed by the French, and you have this group in the center called the Humanos. Think of Queequeg and Moby Dick. Remember the harpooner, roughly 7 foot, tattooed from brow to stem, and these were the Humanos. They were still on the foot, using dogs to carry their material. They were average 6'7". They could pull the backbone out of the horse. And this woman appeared amongst them for solidly 3 years. Now, normally that would remain a legend and we could let it go. But the long story short is that it was documented both in Texas, or the area that become Texas, and also in Spain. And I just got back from Spain a week ago, and where I saw her body lying there 350 years non-corrupt. So figure it out to yourself. But that's what I'm working on now. All right, let's get to this. We got. What's the matter? I love it. The only thing truly consistent about history is its incompleteness. It's virtually a myth until we learn a little bit more, and then we say, well, that's changed. We just talked about it. Charles was talking about the pushing back the date on early man. I grew up with that 12,000-year deadline, and people were willing to fight to hold it. But today we're going to talk about a massive bunch of history, and it takes place in the Spanish West. And initially, let's start out like this. I'm going to jump around. In 1876, George Armstrong Custer lost his life at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Roughly 700 illustrations try to capture what happened there that fatal afternoon. And we're just now getting some idea of what happened. As a result of that fight, is pretty much the end of a lifestyle for the North American Indian. It was pretty much on the ropes by then. There'd be a couple more fights and we'd be done. In let's put it this way, 12 years before George Washington was born, in the Netherlands of Nebraska, there was another battle took place. It involved Europeans and North American Indians. At any rate, we had this battle between Europeans and what we would call Native American, the Pawnee and Oto up in Nebraska in 1720. It was a definitive fight in which the Europeans were very much like Custer put down. But an important thing happened, a number of important things happened. As a result of that fight, two of the most powerful influences, European influences that America, that could be laid upon the Indians, would collide in the year 1720, and that was basically the Spanish horse from the south that had been moving ever steadily toward the northeast, breaking out left and right, but heading northeast, and the French gun coming down from their occupation in Montreal, moving slowly to the south and west. And we'd have Indians with horses and Indians on the grounds with guns, but we wouldn't have the Indian with a horse and the gun, which, unlike the Custer fight, would change the Indian life or as they knew it forever. Okay, let me kind of paint what the United States looked like then. The years, let's call it 1590. Oñate just came up from Mexico City and established the northernmost outpost in the New World, Santa Fe. 1620s, we have Jamestown happening a little bit later. The French are moving into Montreal. By 1630s, the Apaches had stolen enough horses from the Rio Grande Valley in the Santa Fe complex to start heading east toward Texas, where they'd catch our Humano brothers on the ground, and as tough as they were, a man on horseback can overrun a man on the ground anytime. So that conflict is going on. The French, by 1690, La Salle had come down the river, Mississippi River, went outside, went over to France to start a colony in New Orleans, couldn't find his way back, ended up in Matagorda Bay. Eventually the French would put a compound